Hello, and welcome to the Screencast on transition and change in East Asia in the early modern period. This is from Bentley and Ziegler's Chapter 26, 5th edition. Traditions and encounters indeed in this section. You'll be able to find both. Here is the big idea. So you can pause and read that yourself. There's a lot of big words in there, but this is really kind of a way to encapsulate the whole deal. This is what you should be reading for. The term gentry comes up, and I've had enough students ask me about that word that it's not it's a word that can be helpful to know. So you can see the definition here. It's where it's related to the word gentleman in English, and it would be somebody who is you'd call sir, but wouldn't have a formal title like duke. It's a question for you to read for. There are some there are some Japanese words that get used without translation here. The first two probably, maybe, seem familiar. Daimyo means great nobles, and so you can keep track of that in your writing. You could use that, or you could say great nobles. This would not be gentry. They're like the high-ranking noble families, the wealthiest landowners. And then you'll read a bit about sake, rice wine, and sake will be one of those commercial products that's part of the expanding mercantile economy of early modern Japan. And not only is this a luxury good that people would buy in the cities, and so it's part of an expanding kind of commercial middle class. They're going to learn about floating worlds, pleasure zones, if you will, fun places, fun neighborhoods in Japanese cities. It's also part of growing rice in order to turn a profit as opposed to subsistence. So it's going to take a lot of rice to make one bottle of sake. But then you can sell the bottle of sake for probably more than you could all of the rice. Plus, it's cheaper to transport because it's less bulky. Of course, you have to be more careful with it than a sack of rice because you could break the bottle. But maybe it's in kegs, like wooden kegs. So then you're a little better off. But so it's part of the commercial. It's one of those terms to learn. It's part of the commercializing aspect of early modern Japan. We're going to see the big idea of globalizing networks going strong here. And one of the big ideas for the entire time period is that demand for Chinese manufactured goods and Indian manufactured goods continues to drive the global economy. We're still a long ways from European manufactured goods competing with Chinese goods on world markets, although, the Europeans are manufacturing some things. But you can look at it this way. The things that Europeans are bringing places are like bars of iron, useful, but not as fancy as this like lovely lacquerware bowl. It's a delicate item. It's also a luxury, so it has more value per weight, and there's a lot of demand for these things. You should recognize all four of those, with tea gaining in popularity in European countries and also Euro-American colonies as people have a little more spending money that they can use to buy, mild luxuries like tea. Japan is importing a lot of silver, and that is again one of the huge ideas. Japan, did I say Japan? Japan's exporting silver. China's importing silver, and Chinese imports of silver on the global market is going to be one of the big driving forces in all of global commerce. So it's a really big deal. So you should pay attention to that. This is the silver time period. In the last time period, the late medieval, we looked at the gold trade and Trans-Saharan networks and Indian Ocean networks, and that's important. And gold's still important here, but silver is really the star of the global economy in this time period, at least especially the first part. Okay? China's also importing delicious spices that don't grow there, like nutmeg. Globalizing networks, of course, includes cultural diffusion too, and we have limited spread of Christianity into China and Japan. Both countries limit the entrance of foreign ideas during this time period, as do all of the main Afro-Eurasian states and the European colonies in the Americas, where there are official religions, and in some places, famously in France, religious toleration actually takes a step back. It's really only in the Muslim empires like the Mughal Empire, the Ottoman Empire, where we see a growth of religious toleration during this time period. So in this way, Japan and China are more like the western part of Eurasia. But there is some exchange of knowledge that comes from this before missionaries are expelled. Part of global exchange is also the Columbian exchange, and it's important to take your Columbian exchange knowledge up a notch from whatever you may have learned the first time you heard this term, either in previous chapters or in US history if you had that earlier, and look at foodstuffs going to East Asia. In particular, the sweet potato becomes a big deal in China, but also in Japan, where there's a statue like to the sweet potato, which I mean I think is justified. And look, sweet potatoes can be turned into noodles, which appear to be delicious. And the sweet potato is also nutritious, generating a lot of calories. The important thing to understand about why the sweet potato leads to growth and population in China is to know that it can be grown in areas, especially hilly areas that are too steep for terracing or the soil isn't rich enough for growing rice. And so it expands the amount of possible farmland. And so people move on to that farmland. So the population of China was growing, and that didn't cause a crisis, at least not until like the toward the end of the 18th century. That growing population did not cause a crisis because as it was growing, under the Ming, the sweet potato was introduced, and then now there's more lands available for people to move on to. And so the Han Chinese, or like ethnically Chinese population, continued to expand. Um, and like in other places, it's almost a kind of settler colonialism in China at the expense of non-Han Chinese. In in China, people including in South Central China, like Hmong people. But also, there's a lot of other ethnic groups like that in the highlands that were kind of forced, face pressure from this expanding Chinese settlement and state. It's a long way from the sweet potato to that. So let's come on back and just say sweet potato, new foods from the Americas lead to population growth in Asia, much like they do in Europe and Africa. This expanding global commerce is going to I was going to say change. I was going to put pressure on the social structure because, like in other places, you're going to have across the world, there's going to be a growing merchant class that may not have traditionally been socially elite. Like that wasn't the most desirable occupation to go into for young men, but it's increasingly lucrative in this era of global trade. And so that's going to, merchants are this new economic elite, or there's a bigger group of elite merchants, would be a better way to put it. But at the same time, the traditional elites coming from traditional studies, like in China, that will be the literati, the scholar bureaucrats, and in Japan, the samurai, who will go from having a primarily military function to a primarily cultural function during this time. Those traditional elites remain. So there's going to be tension here because we have, you got too many elites or different kinds of elites. So pay attention to that. The forces of tradition will continue to use Neo-Confucianism in order to maintain social order and hierarchy. So that's part of where that tension is going to come from. So in order to be accepted, new wealthy people will have to buy into the Neo-Confucian ideals to some level. But of course, those ideals also don't view them as legitimate as people who produce things with their hands, or even better, with knowledge. And so it's going to create some social tensions. These are both places are going to have expanding states, and expanding is going to mean, in the case of Japan, unifying the main islands of Japan and centralizing authority, and then using a bureaucratic set of elites. In China, the Ming and then Qing dynasties are going to maintain the imperial tradition of centralized rule, again using scholar bureaucrats. And then there's two terms that will come up here, and these will be court appointed officials, mandarins and eunuchs. So those are different. Those are different things, but pay attention to both of those as possible pieces of evidence for your essays. Finally, the kind of coming on to this last bit is there's three states that are worth knowing by name here. So the Ming Dynasty in China is the dynasty that followed the Mongols. And you'll see they followed the traditional imperial rule. The emperors wore the dragon robe and followed employed scholar bureaucrats and delegated power to ministers throughout the country who would report to them. They also built the Forbidden City, so it's one of the examples of monumental architecture in the early modern period. So you can compare that with various European states, and also in chapter 27 with the Mughals and the Safavids and the Ottomans. So this is one of those things. There's lots of examples of great big buildings that are meant to impress the followers of the citizens, the subjects. Citizens are more subjects than citizens, honestly, of these countries. So the Forbidden City is the palace zone in Beijing near Tiananmen Square, and it was, massive palaces, literally palatial, and it meant to impress the citizens. Okay? Under both dynasties, there was expansion. The Qing dynasty is the dynasty that followed the Ming, and the last dynasty in China. It has some similarities to the Yuan dynasty in that it was founded by people from outside of the traditional Chinese homeland and non-ethnically Chinese. They were Manchurian or Manchu. And then they took the name Qing as their imperial name. You can see on the map there where the Qing homeland is right there in Manchuria. So they expanded. That's also going to create another way that there's going to be new elites, because Manchu elites now will be Chinese imperial elites. Under both dynasties, China expanded, and under the Qing, it got to its largest extent ever, which is pretty big. Right. Tokugawa Japan. Tokugawa then is a family name. Ming and Qing are like reign names. They're one means brilliant, the other one means pure. Both those words have a bunch of connotations to them. In Chinese, Tokugawa is a family, and they were the family of the shoguns. The shogun was the great barbarian quelling generalissimo, which is just one of the best titles in all of world history. And so they established a shogunate, or rule by shoguns. There was still officially an emperor, but most of the actual governing power was vested in the shoguns. It's not really it's a little bit like a constitutional monarchy in the sense that the monarch's a figurehead, except there's no constitution. So it's more like a military dictatorship. But the shoguns at that time weren't able to act like 20th century dictators, but they did gain increasing control over the nobility. Like Louis XIV in France, might remember from chapter 23, the Tokugawa shoguns invite the daimyo, the great lords, to come and live in the capital city, Edo, what's now Tokyo, so they could be supervised essentially by the shogun. And a result of this was a more centralized, unified Japanese state that was able to regulate its interactions with foreigners. Sometimes textbooks and students will overemphasize how isolated Japan became, and that's because the kind of Eurocentric nature of a lot of the sources that are used by the textbooks. From a European perspective, Japan did try to close itself off. But for one thing, Japan and China continued to interact with each other, and China was still the world's largest market and the world's largest exporter. So you're not very isolationist if you're still interacting with the biggest trading partner in the world. Additionally, some Europeans were allowed to trade in Japan, and there were Japanese scholars who studied what was called Dutch learning, the Dutch as sort of the representative European group, and learned a lot about European culture and monitored a lot of things that were happening in the world. So you should be careful. Japan did pass something called the Seclusion Edict that was meant to regulate its interaction with foreigners, but I would caution students against taking that too literally. You're better off comparing it to mercantilism, or as some say, mercantilism, in the European states trying to regulate their trade contacts with other parts of the world in order to maintain the authority of the state. So this is a common thing across Eurasia in that way. So kind of pay attention to that and go for the nuance, right? that complexity point on your LEQ on this topic by showing understanding of the nuance. All right. So you can look for those three names and then the interactions that they had with the rest of the world. All right. Happy reading.